It's a fact that Korean horror films often blend murder mysteries with psychological terror. But before we jump into today's movie, let me ask you one thing. How many of you actually know about the dark web? Is that hidden side of the internet that's hard to access, where all kind of illegal stuff happens? Today's Korean horror movie explores one of the darkest spaces of that world. The movie is called Commission, and honestly, it's a bit too long for my taste, and the story is just okay. Hello everybody, I am Karryshh, and today the story follows a girl named Dan Gyung. She dreams of becoming a famous webtoon artist, but how she tries to make that happen will seriously creep you out. And hey, if you're new to Demonic Archives, hit that subscribe button, like the video, and share it around. Follow me on Instagram, I personally reply to everyone there. Now let's dive straight into the chilling story of Commission. The story begins with Dan, who talks about her dream of becoming a master webtoon creator, basically a comic artist. But as we all know, creative talent is often unappreciated in this world. Sure, social media now gives artists a platform, but before that, small artists really struggle to survive. Even now, it's tough. But at least today, there's some opportunity to showcase your work. Sadly, that wasn't the case for Dan. She worked hard as an assistant teacher in an art college, but she was just bored out of her mind. Still, she was a good teacher and cared about her students, especially a student named Hoon, who was the same age as her. Now, one day, a student storms out angrily after breaking a statue, but the head teacher, Mina, told her she would never make it as an artist. The incident leads to a teacher's meeting, and Dan starts feeling like she doesn't belong there. Then we find out that Hoon is actually Dan's friend as well, who used to post his comics online. Through their conversation, we also learned about Dan's sister, Ju, and she's a much popular cartoon artist. Ju gets invited to conferences, and everyone's always excited about her next story. But from Ju's expression, we can tell that she's exhausted and mentally drained in this career. Now back to Dan and Hoon, where Dan shows him some of her drawings, but he has to leave early, which upsets her, because actually she likes him. Now no one really seemed interested in Dan's work, and that's partly why Dan secretly felt jealous of her sister's success. The next day, Mina wins a webtoon competition, but it was the same one Dan had entered as well, and that just makes Dan even more mad. Later that night, Dan looks through Mina's drawings, and Mina was the artist of a comic book called Starlight Princess, which was all about fairy tale princesses, something Dan couldn't understand. She couldn't get why people loved such childish stories when she had the real artistic talent. Then, out of nowhere, a mysterious girl messages Dan online and offers her 50,000 won to create a special drawing. Dan agrees, cause the theme was exactly her style, and that's when we discover her dark side. Dan actually likes to draw adult, evil, and vulgar art. She creates a twisted version of Mina's Starlight Princess, turning it into something unholy and obscene. The next day, that drawing goes viral, and Mina quickly finds out Dan was the one who made it. Things spiral out of control. Dan gets scolded badly, and even her sister Ju is called into the school. But thanks to Ju's influence, Dan somehow avoids major punishment. Still, she's fired from her job as an assistant teacher. Ju then tries to explain that using someone else's character in such a vulgar way is wrong. No true artist would appreciate that. But since Dan had no job now, Ju helps her out by sending her to Jin Pil, a well-known artist who needed an assistant. Dan was a huge fan of Jin, so working for him was like a dream come true. At Jin's house, she meets Song, another one of Jin's students, who helps him out but he has a bad temper. And she also meets Park, Jin's other assistant. Together, the four of them start working on a sci-fi comic, and that's where things begin to get dark. Before long, Song starts harassing Dan. He locks her in a room, forces her to draw, and then throws her artwork away. Later, Park explains the reason behind Song's behavior. Turns out Dan's sister Ju and Song used to work together as Jin's assistant, but Jin promoted Ju instead of Song. Ever since then, Song's been jealous of her, and now he's taken that frustration out on Dan. However, Park tells her just to ignore him and not pay attention. Then Park shows Dan some of his own drawings, and surprisingly, They look just like her work. Dan doesn't tell him that she enjoys drawing dark, adult-themed art, but she learns that Park upload his work on dark web, where he makes a lot of money. Park even teaches her how to use it, but once Dan sees what kind of disturbing stuff exists on dark web, she literally threw up. Now a month passes by. Dan keeps working hard, but her hands start to ache from all the non-stop drawing, and she begins making mistakes. Song yells at her constantly, but Jin, he is a genuine kind man, and he always comforts her and gives her good advice. Later, Dan visits Hoon, who's now dropped out of college. They talk about everything going on in their lives, but Hoon tells her something that completely shocks her. He's now dating teacher Mina. Hearing this breaks Dan's heart because she liked him, and she actually called him today to ask him out. Anyway, heartbroken, she returns home and she feels miserable. She doesn't want to do anything anymore. However, she was desperate for money and success, and that's why she opens up the dark web. There, she starts chatting on an online forum where someone offers her 400,000 won for a drawing. But the catch is, it was something illegal, something I can't even talk about openly. But now Dan was so desperate, she agrees and earns the money. Then she goes to Mina and gives her the cash, since Mina had filed a court case against her last month. But now Mina refuses to take the money. In fact, she even forgives Dan. She tells her that she will drop the court case, but she has realized that she's been too harsh on her before. Now here Mina genuinely meant well, but Dan took it the wrong way. She felt insulted, like Mina was treating her with pity. That's why furious, Dan creates a dark web profile under the name Taiji and decides to start working there full time. Soon she meets a guy named Hanya who wanna collaborate with her. He will sell the drawing she will make and then they will split the commission. Dan agrees, but Hanya's first request was disturbing. He asked Dan to name someone she wants to unalive, and of course, in that moment, Dan thinks of Mina. Then Hanya tells her to draw Mina, but in the drawing, Mina should be unalived. Not only that, but Dan must draw this drawing while having the intent of unaliving Mina. Dan agrees without hesitation because she was furious and she already enjoys making dark, evil arts. That's why she sits down and starts drawing. Now as she draws, she feels an almost twisted sense of joy. In the artwork, she brutally unalived Mina and Hanya absolutely loved the drawing. Finishing that piece makes Dan happier than ever, and that same day, she even pitches a new idea for Jin's comic and everyone's love it. Finally, it seems like her good days have begun. Now soon, Dan becomes famous on the dark web. She makes ton of money and gets everything she ever wanted. Before long, she is a hashtag #1 webtoon designer on the dark web. But that happiness doesn't last. One day, while she's with her sister Ju, Dan notices that Ju's fan adore her, while Dan's own fan don't even know who she is, since she has to hide her identity online. Around the same time, the police discover teacher's Mina's dead body, murdered in a horrifying demonic way. The cybercrime unit gets involved because Mina's death photo had surfaced on the dark web as a webtoon design, and it was the same drawing Dan made. Soon, Dan realizes this horrifying truth. Someone unalived Mina exactly the way she drew it, and that someone had to be Hanya, especially since she had given him Mina's company's address. She is struck with guilt immediately, realizing she is responsible for an innocent woman's death. But then, Hanya messages her. He thanks her, and that's when the dark secret comes out. Hanya turns out to be a serial unaliver who murdered his victim in creative, artistic ways. He even sends Dan a picture of Mina's mutilated body, and it's exactly like the drawing Dan made, which was just so horrifying for a YouTube video. Now panicking, Dan runs home, but on the way, she bumps into Detective Lee, who's investigating Mina's murder. Lee asks Dan about the murder, the dark web, and the drawings, which terrifies Dan. Now here she doesn't say anything at first, but in the next scene, we jump in future, where we see her sitting in the police station with Lee, and and she had confessed everything that happened. But there was more to the story. Lee asked Dan why she hid the story before, and that's when Dan tells the full truth and we go back in the past. You see, the night after Mina's unalivement, Jin had encouraged Dan, saying she could still become a great cartoonist like her sister. His words made Dan realize that if she went to jail now, she will never achieve success. That's why that night, she hacked Park's computer. Using his system, she contacted Hanya on the dark web, and she even turned off the VPN, making Park's device traceable. Then the next day, Detective Lee's team tracked the location and arrested Park, thinking he was behind the dark web activity. It was all part of Dan's plan, and she watched him being taken away while smirking demonically. At this point, Dan had completely lost her mind. Her obsession with becoming famous had turned her insane. Even though she was now popular on the dark web, she also craved love, so the next day, she called Hoon and took him to Jin's house, introducing him as Park's replacement assistant. But Jin didn't look happy to see him. It was written all over his face. Still, since they needed someone to fill Park's spot, he agreed. Song, however, was furious. He thought Hoon was just a newbie who didn't deserve to work in such a prestigious studio. Song started yelling at both Dan and Hoon, which led to a heated argument, and watching the chaos at his house, Jin fainted. Now you see, Song respected his teacher really much, and after Jin fainted, Song decided to quit the studio entirely. Then later that night, as Song was packing his thing, he noticed a CCTV camera in the room. On it was footage from the night Dan had intentionally used Park's computer to talk to Hanya. Song sends the footage to Dan and threatens to go to the police, which made Dan panic and she rushes to his place. At first, she tries to apologize, but Song keeps insulting her, pushing her buttons until she snaps. She turns violent, almost evil, and starts fighting him for the footage. During the struggle, Dan even stabs Song's hand and screams that she will become the world's best artist no matter what. But then out of nowhere, Hanya appears and starts strangling Song. He unalives Song brutally, revealing that he had been watching Dan the entire time. It turns out Hanya is a Japanese guy who now promises to protect Dan, but only if she keeps making drawings for him so he can continue unaliving people in artistic ways. Dan here completely freezes, because when Hanya was just an online figure, she felt in control, but now seeing the unaliver face to face, she has no idea what to do. Trying to stay calm, she says that she doesn't want to murder anyone because this will ruin her life. But Song was already dead, and that's why Hanya then drags Song's body into the bathroom, chops it into little pieces, and disposes of it, all while explaining to Dan that her drawings give him purpose in life. To him, unalivement is an art form, and Dan's art made him an artist. A few days later, Song's disappearance becomes public. Meanwhile, Ju visits Park, who has just been released from custody due to lack of evidence. She asks him where Song went and why the police arrested him in the first place. By now, Ju is starting to suspect that her sister might be involved in all of this. Park tells her that his computer had been hacked and that someone named Taiji on dark web had done something shady. Then, Ju goes home and checks Dan's computer, where she finds the dark web still logged in under the username Taiji. Here, she finally realizes that her sister is actually Taiji and she might be involved in this murder. Ju immediately tells everything to Jin, who has just regained consciousness in the hospital after fainting earlier. She doesn't want Jin's reputation to get ruined cause of her sister. Later, Dan visits Jin in the hospital and she was happy to see him awake, but Jin calmly tells her that she still needs more training and experience, and that's how he fires her indirectly. But by now, Dan is fully consumed by her obsession. She truly believes she's the greatest artist in the world and can do anything. She now starts arguing with Jin. She insists that he will never be able to finish his own comic without her, and hearing this, Jin finally snaps and yells at her before leaving.
Kamala, you're fired! Get out of here! You're fired!
This makes Dan even more furious, and the next day she showed up at Jin's conference with a bottle of ink, planning to throw it on him to teach him a lesson. But when she heard Jin's speech, she froze. His words were so inspiring that she started feeling guilty. Maybe there was still some humanity left inside her after all. After this, Dan went to meet Hanya near a sewer and told him a story from her childhood. When she was a child, she once won first place in a drawing competition. But the truth was that her sister Ju had drawn the picture for her. Dan got credit for something she didn't do, and from that day on, she never won again. Deep down, she began to hate her sister for it, and that's why she had dedicated her life to become the greatest webtoon artist in the world. After the story, Dan tells Hanya that she will become successful in her career, and the only way she can do it is by working with Jin again. But since Jin had already fired her, she had no idea what to do. That's when Hanya manipulates her, telling her to make a drawing of Jin's death, saying that Jin is the one holding her back from success. After manipulation, Dan goes home and draws a horrific scene where Jin dies in a brutal way. She gives the drawing to Hanya, but at the same time, she doesn't want to unalive Jin. Meanwhile, Jin had invited Ju to meet him. Jin tells Ju that he has decided to rehire Dan because he can't finish his comic without her. Ju refuses, and she warns him that she suspects that her sister is involved in something terrible. But Jin doesn't listen. He even asks Hoon to come back and work with them. Then Hoon calls Dan and tells her the news, and she was shocked because just moments ago, she had basically signed Jin's death sentence. Now panicking, Dan runs through a storm to try to save him, but she collapses midway from exhaustion, and the scene cuts off from there. We go back to the police station, where Detective Lee and Dan are talking. This is the same moment from earlier. Dan keeps calling out for her sister, and when Ju finally arrives, she refuses to even look at her. From Ju's word, it was clear that Dan has done something terribly wrong. Meanwhile, the police are now searching for Hanya, hoping to uncover the actual truth. Back in the past, Jin is home alone when suddenly Hanya appears behind him. He starts beating Jin mercilessly, but before he can unalive him, Dan bursts in and stops him. Dan pleads with Hanya, saying she made a terrible mistake and she doesn't want Jin to die. But Hanya was completely insane. He was a full-blown serial unaliver who enjoys unalivement. Screaming that he won't stop now, Hanya slashes Jin's throat right in front of Dan. She's horrified and frozen in shock after his death. After murder, Hanya turns his attention to Dan, trying to scare her and convince her to become like him. But before he can do anything, police siren starts wailing outside. It turns out before coming to Jin's house, Dan had called Detective Lee to tell her everything. But by the time Detective arrived, it was too late. Hanya has already escaped. He even destroys all the evidence by putting his phone and Dan's phone in the microwave. With no proof left against him, the police take Dan into custody, where she tells Detective Lee everything that happened so far. Finally, back in the prison, Detective Lee tries to explain Ju that maybe it all was Hanya's fault, since he was the one who manipulated Dan into doing all this. But Ju doesn't believe it. She knows her sister too well. She knows how obsessed and unstable Dan has always been about her career. Deep down, Ju is certain that if those people really were murdered, that Dan absolutely had the intent to see him die. Just then, Detective Lee's assistant arrived with new information. They have managed to recover data from Hanya's burned phone. It turns out that Hanya had unalived a person when he was younger. After that, he escaped to Korea and changed his identity. Even in Korea, there were multiple complaints filed against him, and now the police had gathered enough evidence to prove it that he was the serial unaliver. They also found photos of the victim on his phone, but as Dan looks through the recovered photos, she freezes. One of the drawings found on Hanya's phone wasn't hers. But who made this drawing? This mystery would be revealed in the end. Not only this, but this drawing leads to the murder of Jin. Now the scene shifts to Ju, sitting in her office, looking stressed and worried about her sister, when suddenly, Hanya shows up. This time he wants to unalive Ju. He believed that Dad had ruined his life, and now he wanted revenge by destroying hers. Hanya attacks Ju viciously, but in the struggle, Ju grabs a pen and stabs him in the neck. Hanya collapses, bleeding out, but before dying, he takes out Dan's iPad Then a few days later, we learned that Hanya reset the iPad and all the digital evidence was erased, meaning the police had no proof that Dan ever made those dark web drawings. Detective Lee knows Dan is guilty, but without evidence, the court lets her off with just community service. Instead of jail time, he's only required to clean streets, but deep inside, Dan is still haunted by something else. Yes, Dan had drawn the image of Jin's death, but that specific drawing, the one that matched the murder, wasn't hers. She knows someone else made it. The story then cuts to Ju, who actually benefited the most from Jin's death. After he died, his sci-fi comic legally passed to Ju since there was no one else to publish it. As a result, Ju became even more famous. One day then Dan shows up at her office to confront her. She knows that Ju was the one who made that drawing. It's a little complicated here, but here's how it went down. Dan had drawn a picture of Jin's death and sent it to Hanya, but Ju found all this out. She was about to call the police when Hanya messaged Dan. Hanya said that he didn't like Dan's drawing because it didn't feel real. You see, Dan didn't truly want Jin dead, and that lack of emotion showed in her art piece. After that, Ju took Dan's place and started talking to Hanya herself. She knew that if Jin died, the right to his comic would go to her, and so Jun made the fatal drawing with genuine intent, meaning it was Ju's drawing that led to Jin's actual death, not Dan's. When Dan confronts her with this truth, Ju is shocked for a moment but quickly regains control. She refuses to admit anything and mocks her sister instead. Ju tells Dan that even if what she's saying is true, no one will ever believe her because Dan hides behind the dark web while Ju thrives in the real world. Those words completely break Dan. She loses her sanity. The two sisters got even a brutal fight, but Ju won that fight as well. Even more heartbroken after the fight, that night Dan calls Hoon and tells him everything, the whole truth about herself, her dark web identity and everything. And obviously Hoon was stunned. Here we find out that Dan no longer wants to hide. She wants the entire world to know that she is Taiji, the dark web artist. But before she can do anything, the police arrive and arrest her. Dan finally ends up behind bars, bringing the movie to its chilling end. Well, that was the story of Commission Korean Horror. Honestly, the concept was interesting, but the movie itself wasn't great. It was about 2 hours long and filled with unnecessary scenes that I didn't even mention here. The film's theme was supposed to revolve around the dark web, but instead, it turned into psychological terror of a teenager and a murder mystery, which was not a mystery to begin with. Personally, I rate this movie only 3 out of 10. Still, if you want to watch this movie, go ahead and tell me your rating in the comment box. If you like the video, don't forget to subscribe, like and share. Follow me on Instagram where I reply to everyone personally. And with that, I'll see you all in the next one. Till then, stay happy, stay alert and stay awake. Cause at night, they always see you. And by they, I mean spirits, ghosts and demons.